Thanks for coming, guys. Monday night. I'll just do a quick intro to myself, and then I'll intro the panel. So I work at the ABC on their digital design team, but I think where I kind of fit into this is like, for me, like sustainable design, and even coming from a digital background, seems like the future. It seems like the way forward a lot personally. So I'm super stoked to be emceeing the panel. I'll start by just introing the panel firstly. So Cameron, on my right. So Cameron was the Director of Design Studies and Doctoral Studies at Carnegie Mellon University School of Design, but has recently returned to Sydney to be the Professor of Design at UNSW. Lucky us, it says in backgrounds. His current focus is a shift from sustainable design to transition design, i.e. the role design can play in affecting multi-level, multi-stage societal transitions in the systems that resource our everyday lives. Boom. We'll now go to Grace. She has spent the last decade trying to unpack the role design plays in realizing sustainable futures. This journey started at Pratt CSDS in 2009. So now she's at Deloitte, and so within Deloitte Digital, she helps government agencies and organizations execute resilient transformational strategies and bring about place-based system change that respond to the challenges and technologies that might shape the near future through experimentation and participatory/co-design research. Welcome. All right. Chris, you got a nice solid paragraph as well, mate. Hey, Half. Well, he's the Director of Lava Asia Pacific and an adjunct professor at the University of Technology, Sydney. So whilst Associate Architect at PTW Architects, his work on the Watercube Olympic Swimming Centre in Beijing received the Atmosphere Award at the 9th Venice Architecture Biennale. Since then, he won an Emerging Architect Award from RIBA in 2008, London, and he is a 40 under 40 award person in 2012, or he won it. So congrats. There's a bunch of other awards here. Okay. Well, you've done well, mate. You've done well. And Rob, last but not least, he's a professor of sustainable urban environments at UTS and designs counterintuitive solutions for a sustainable urban future, mainly focusing on climatic impacts and how the city could respond or anticipate at different urban scales. So metropolitan, urban, precinct, neighborhood, public space, and so on. So it's, I'm going to be honest with you, we've got 4 kind of questions to kind of create a rough narrative about how we're going to work tonight. So the main thing I think, but before we're going to dive in, is actually just to start with this idea of sustainable design. So what I'd like to do is just basically ask each of the panelists to talk about what sustainable design means to them from their perspective, because we actually are going to see 4 very slightly overlapping but different perspectives. So Cameron, I'll kick off with you, mate.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for having me. So I've always been concerned that sustainable design should actually be about change. I'm never interested in finding ways of making less impactful business as usual. And that tends to mean heading towards the kind of eco-socialist side of things. So inequality would be the #1 unsustainability I would see in our society. So I would say sustainable design eradicates inequality and the 1%.
I would say sustainable design avoids dystopic futures. So avoids us falling off a cliff, essentially.
Yes, sustainable design. As architects, we're always in this dilemma where we have to design things. We build things, essentially. So someone once said, I'm the most sustainable architect of all times because I don't actually get to build anything. And we're kind of trying to take the opposite approach, where we're trying to build as much as we can, but as smart as we can. And that's a challenge, but that's kind of where we're coming from. We're trying to do like more, we say more with less, so we don't want to stop building, developing, designing, but we want to do it with less impact, less material, less energy, etc.
Yeah, sustainable design. I think it should talk later on a little bit on scales of things, but probably the basic thing for me would be to design something that doesn't ruin the world we're in, and even anticipates future change that we can expect.
Thanks, guys. We're going to dive straight into the first question. And Grace, I'm going to pass to you to kick it off. So listen up, folks. So can design facilitate societal change, signal renewed human intention, and bring form to resilient/sustainable futures by harnessing collective intelligence and experimenting with possible futures?
I tried to get a lot into this.
Even do your intro, it was pretty solid. Like it was just one rolling flow. It was good. But yeah, no, please elaborate. Like, let's kick it off and then we'll throw around to the other guys.
What was the question?
10 points.
All right. So can sustainable design facilitate societal change? Yeah. So in my opinion, we don't do much. We think a lot. We protest a lot, but we don't action much. So in my view, the way that we need to realise sustainable futures, if you can call it that, is by doing more. And I think that the challenges that we're facing today, even though, we've always been we've faced some pretty crazy challenges throughout human existence. But today we're facing some other kinds of challenges around, our digital identity and what that means. And, I don't know who's watched the ABC in the last week, but everyone's all about the AI now. A lot of the work that I do is, how are we going to work with robots in the future? What does that mean? Does that have an implication on sustainable design? So when you look at, ways that we can create more sustainable futures and renew human intention, I think that we have to do more. And to do more, I think we can experiment more. And when I say experiment, I mean because we're dealing with very foreign concepts like what it's like to work with a robot or what it's like to drive around in an autonomous vehicle or what it's, for some people, what it's like to go to work in a more simple sense. We need to understand what are the implications of that. So building experiments, building prototypes on a small scale that challenges the way that we do things today to think of better ways to do things, or, we have these current systems. It's like, how can we render the current systems we have redundant by making better systems? I think those things should be experimented with and prototyped to be able to renew that human intention, because you're training yourself to be more active again. Did I answer that?
Yeah, that was good.
I don't know the question.
Interesting. Cameron, I feel like you're going to have some solid things to add to this. It's okay. You can work without it. Project. I feel like you're going to have something to add to this, just to kick it off as well, with transition design being your focus at the moment, and we talked about systems thinking and that whole idea and the need for prototyping. So I don't know, how would you, from what we just heard then, how would you respond?
I think, so I'll begin by being critical and saying that the last couple of decades of sustainable design have been pathetic and a failure because to some extent they were always a reformist project. They were always about lessening ecological impact and not actually about creating alternative futures. And occasionally you would have inspired designers who would say, no, we need systems level change, but they had no actual mechanisms or theories of change or particular skills in order to affect that kind of large ambition. And I think what's happened in the last couple of decades is other movements, other kind of discourses, other politics, and also just the nature of the world has shifted. And it's now possible for design to play a really important and significant role, not just making things or value propositions for right now, but actually for affecting multi-stage change by creating platforms that enable people to do one thing and then enabling to follow up with another, and so doing kind of second-order futuring in that way. And I think one of the keys to that, which everybody who is not a designer now wants a piece of, is prototyping and experimentation. And so one of the things that designers kind of have, which they used to just use in their studio to kind of affect just creating a thing that hopefully you could just turn the key on, get some paid for, good, product done, see you later. Now, that's actually the mechanism by which we begin experimenting with real structural change in how our societies operate. So I think all of a sudden designers are in a position of actually affecting large-scale change. Unfortunately, they were all educated to just create single products. And so there's this gap where they wanted to do more, they didn't quite know how to do more, they were always just servicing clients, building products or buildings. And all of a sudden, these other discourses have enabled them to do this kind of change. So now's the moment in which they could step in, but unfortunately, they don't seem to be well enough equipped, and they just end up moving post-it notes in a design thinking workshop. And so there is now an opportunity to actually start doing really significant social change if designers are a lot bolder, a lot more ambitious, and a lot better informed, and realise that they are the pinch point on a whole bunch of systems changes. Everybody needs design. Nobody really understands it, even designers. So I kind of think right now there is a fantastic opportunity, but it's a closing window, and it's something we've got to move quite fast on. So I think I would follow up and say, absolutely, we can do large-scale change. There are a whole bunch of discourses that people need, that people need to kind of re-equip themselves, relearn. Everybody should be continuous learning in like an institution like here, Academy XI. They should be doing that kind of stuff all the time with respect to affecting these societal transitions.
Solid. Chris, Rob, I mean, you guys are both in the built environment, so I think we've sort of got this. I mean, how does it play out there? You know, in terms, like, I mean, even touching on prototyping and the discourse and the mindset that comes with what you do. You know, I mean, if that's, you know, are you guys thinking about it on a societal level, and you know, is it more a little bit more focused? Like, you know, how do you guys impact when it comes to social change?
Yeah, I would like to talk a little bit about technology that you have touched on, and technology that is constantly changing, and therefore something you have to be constantly up to speed and re-educate yourself. But I also want to talk about nature, and that's, I think, what for us as architects are the two things that really drive us. So prototyping is great, but looking at, you know, I was just on the Greek islands 2 weeks ago, lucky me, and some of these buildings are 2,000 years old. And yes, they did prototyping. They built it 10 times till it stood up. You know, in Santorini, they had a volcano eruption. Then they started building caves into the lava, essentially, and built houses out of that. They didn't have trees, so they built walls to support the roof. And that's sustainable design, right? With what you have, what you need, and trying to work with the environment, trying to naturally ventilate, trying to shield yourself from external forces, trying to you know, orientate towards the sun and towards the views, etc. And but that was, you know, 2,000 years ago, over the last 2,000 years. And so the interesting thing about architecture is that it constantly needs to redefine itself, and we're trying to kind of redefine it constantly by applying principles that are valid from nature, that are about water, about air, about sun, about recycling. It's also a principle from nature. And then merge that with latest technologies, and not take something that is there anyway and just plug in some technology on top and say, now it should be sustainable. You know, a nuclear power plant with solar panels should be sustainable. So it's kind of going back to first principles and then apply latest principles which constantly change. And I think that that trend is kind of, it's a mega trend, and I think it has been for the last 10, 15 years probably emerging, and it seems to emerge on so many levels. I mean, when you look at this place, You know, when the 90s were all about like Philip Stark, fancy design places, then now it's all about the kind of recycled look and bamboo and plywood and so on, even if it's a brand new building. I'm not sure about this one actually, but often you walk into spaces and say like, oh, that's so nice to be in an old building, but it's brand new. So it's completely part of the trend to mimic the old to create the new. And but so just in one sentence, I think the only chance to be contemporary as an architect is to combine these principles that are millions of years old with constant changing technology and be open to technology and learn about it and everything, but also be critical about what is redundant.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Rob, did you want to bounce off that?
Yeah, sure. The word societal, I think, means that people do things together or something. And I see in society that people do their own thing, basically, a lot of times. And that means, in my opinion, that the role of government is more or less gone. If people start doing their own thing, then there is nothing that binds them together anymore. And government had that role in the past. And the second thing is, there's a lot of things going to change in the next 10, 20 years. That's probably enormous, not only from a technological point of view, but also climate change, economic change will absolutely change the society completely. And we don't know exactly what's going to happen. Most of us think, well, it's more or less the same as we know now. So we are not prepared at all for that kind of futures. We're not thinking about it. Autonomous vehicles, fantastic, but no one is really thinking about it. People can't believe it, and it's happening. It's actually happening. So that whole thinking and change and anticipating what's going to happen in the future is more or less pulled back by a force that is very traditional, thinking in old paradigms. Most of them are from the engineering perspective. So if we can measure things, then we know exactly how much from something we need to make. So my pledge would be to talk about adaptability of all our systems, the urban system, maybe smaller systems, I don't care, but the adaptability of things is essential in our future thinking. And we need some kind of radical way of dealing with the future instead of going on in the same incremental way. Because that way we're never going to make it. If we just continue our incremental steps by steps, we will end up by 4 degrees or 5 degrees global warming. That's what we know. But no one is really saying we need to go 1 degree or even less. And the only thing we can do that is to try to be societal again, as a group of people that's starting to move forward in a more radical way and think differently about how the government should operate. What kind of new type of governance do we need to actually start that type of future? Not only basically to anticipate that types of future. We don't know exactly what's going to happen. That's the exciting part of it, I think. That should, for everyone, be fantastic. But we don't even believe that's going to happen. Most of us.
All right.
Can I just add, from a built environment perspective, I think there's change happening in the way that you look at the built environment, that you do look at it from a more systemic point of view and as an organism. So, you know, historically as designers, we designed a product. There's this thing called like the Danish design ladder that, you know, suggests that, you know, design keeps moving to, you know, it's different stages, and now we're into like design for systems, design for policy, design for democracy, that kind of stuff. It doesn't mean that the chair isn't important, but the way that we look at the chair has to fit within a greater context. So when we look at the future, like autonomous vehicles, It's not just designing for autonomous vehicles. We have to design for people to get to the autonomous vehicle. We have to design for that autonomous vehicle to end up somewhere and you to move on. You have to look at everything to be able to affect change. Otherwise, you have an autonomous vehicle that no one wants to ride. And with that comes a big culture shift. So if we want radical change for the future, you need to radically change the way people want to live, I think.
Can I jump on that? And I hate autonomous vehicles. I never thought there would be such an explicit push on behalf of a technology such as we're currently experiencing. Like it's amazing how many times you can wake up and open any publication anywhere and be told it's coming, you have no choice, get used to it, here it is, it's going to be fantastic, you're not going to have to pay insurance anymore, or something. And one of the reactions I have, which picks up this question of governance and what it means to kind of be societal again, and what I think is a really crucial part of any kind of vision for a sustainable future, is just kind of changing the way we think these things arrive and giving more agency to the capacity to say no. Right, so right now, I would like to say no to autonomous vehicles. And it's absolutely apparently impossible for me to say no to that because I will be walking in the street. I was living in Pittsburgh and I was cycling on the road next to Uber's basically alpha testing of autonomous vehicles. And I was flicking my bird at them all the time because I hated them, and I was fuzzing them and cycling very close to them and trying to drive them off the road. Because it was not possible to ever say no to that. It was kind of like, live in this experiment, and I didn't want to. And I think it's really interesting to think about non-users. We kind of have this sense that we basically have to accept that everything's changing, and you can't make a choice to say, I would like to adopt a kind of built environment which is slower and more local. I would like to adopt a situation in which I am participating more in the production of my own resourcing rather than being reliant upon systems of resourcing that are global. It's almost impossible to say no to that. So I think a really important part of a lot of designing, for example, is to include moments in the design process in which you contemplate non-users. Not users, but non-users. People who refuse to use. And there's almost no design process in human-centered designing that anybody's using that demands that you actually engage with non-users. So I think this is a really important part of actually saying, yes, we actually need to re-educate how we are as a citizen and not think that it's just about electing Trumbull and his friends. It's actually about deciding on these kinds of technologies. And where are the moments at which we might actually have an opportunity to sculpt those particular visions of the future, rather than hoping that Deloitte turns up and asks me to be in a market research group. And I think this is really an important part of sustainable futures, is actually responding to the crisis in democracy at this kind of level. And that's just...
But then with that, you need to be able to design for scaled participation. And that is, you know, to me, that's my biggest grey area question mark, because, you know, I was saying before, democratized governance sounds amazing. Like, you know, post-capitalism sounds amazing. But capitalism actually did something for some people. And if we talk about equity and, you know, bridging, you know, there's a big gap. There's a lot of rich people. There's a lot of poor people. We live in a very, you know, unjust society. If we want to change that, we need to change people. But how do you do that? How do you enable people to want to participate? You know, it's like this plebiscite thing. Do people want to vote in that thing? No, it's like very unattractive offer. And I'm, you know, I'm gay, so I shouldn't say that. But I think to design for mass participation, to change democracy, that's like a big challenge. But you can't know how you can do that unless you run some experiments, in my view.
Although I'll jump in and just say, I'm trying to pull this back towards kind of UX and digital. And just say, for example, the necessity for designers involved in digital platforms to allow participants to opt out of data collection, and making that as easy and desirable as doing a plebiscite on marriage equality. That these are the kind of mechanisms by which one is actually intervening in the very economy that is sustained by advertising technology, collecting data in order to promote unsustainable consumerism and business as usual. And if you, as a UX designer, if you're a UX designer, decide to make it easy for people to indicate that they don't want their data to be shared with third parties, if you do that, in a funny way, you're doing sustainable design and creating this kind of governance and allowing a bunch of people to say, I would like to use these particular services, but within buildings that are 2,000 years old.
That was a can of worms, wasn't it? Just straight into it. I love it. See, that was one question. That's all we needed, and we're off. Let's talk about digital in a little bit more detail, because, like, user experience as a profession, like I work in it, and it's obviously like booming. You know, and there's been a lot of companies that have had a lot of success from a design perspective, adopting this approach to human-centered design in the context of digital products and experiences. So it's like there's so many people moving towards it. There's so many, you know, people in it. There's so much money in it now. But I think the question is really like, so how can UX as a profession break free of its dependence on that sort of almost like, you know, advertising-driven tech, you know, or it's really driven by profit and growth, and in a way it's driven by a mindset and discourse which doesn't have these values. So how can it break free of that sort of, you know, consumerist, unsustainable business as usual kind of approach? So, Cam?
So this was a little bit my question, even though I've been grandstanding about every other question. The one thing I'll just say very quickly is, having hung around for a while in the sustainable design scene, we were all desperately trying to push economies into shared resource use in the early 2000s. And we did a lot of design work, and we did lots of methodologies, and it was kind of the beginning of service design, and we were trying to say it was now possible to lower the transaction costs of being in the access economy, in which you kind of precisely did what is now mainstream in a co-working space like this. And it was so difficult in the early 2000s, so I just want to register the extent to which, I don't want to say it was capitalism's success, as Grace was just saying, but what I want to say is the digital platforms that arose and the social connectivity which we learned over a decade, and the tolerance we suddenly had for true identity when Facebook brought it in versus the anonymity of the internet, all of that suddenly meant that it was possible to have the sharing economy from, you know, 2005 on. And there are amazing resource-saving possibilities in that. And so one of the incredible things, one of the most significant things in terms of sustainable design has in fact been the creation of the very digital platforms behind the sharing economy, in terms of making major factor reduction in materials intensity and getting a whole bunch of people used to sharing resources like buildings, for example, or like cars. And all of that was amazing. And I just want to register that change. So if you want to sort of ask, how does that change possible? That change was possible, and those of us who were working on the sharing economy before 2005 hadn't anticipated how much cultural change would be affected basically by the UX of those platforms and the social learning that we all acquired, we in developed nations acquired as we did that. Of course, the background to all of that was that you had regular financial investment mechanisms looking to capitalize and skim transactions. And so Airbnb gets acquired, and Uber is an example of one of the most toxic companies in the world as it pursues one of the most unicorn IPOs ever. And never ever use Uber. It's a disgusting company that exploits the drivers and everyone who works for it. Is never going to get hired in any other job if I have anything to do with it, and I have nothing to do with it. Just thought I'd toss that in there. So I think this is the point at which you have to start to say, okay, well, yeah, how do we begin to free UX of its absolute dependence on data acquisition for selling to third-party advertisers to sell unsustainable consumerism? And on the one hand, the answer is I don't know. And on the other hand, the answer is, well, we're moving to situations of much more local economies. We're moving to situations in which value propositions exist in what Chris Anderson used to call the long tail. There are smaller value propositions. You can live in an expensive city like Sydney, being a startup in a place like this. You can. If you don't pursue acquisition later on, if you don't pursue a massive IPO, if you don't fantasize about being a unicorn. So I actually think UX holds the cards in the hand right now for creating alternative lifestyles that are much lighter, that enable people to live more flexibly in existing built environment infrastructures. But it takes a lot of guts to begin saying no to the Facebook model.
All right, guys.
Yeah, I was just clarifying what UX is.
Sorry.
Okay.
I thought it was your ex, but that's something else.
But I suppose just to clarify, like, I work in UX, so Grace, you probably have a good understanding of this as well. Like, for me, it tends to be human-centered design, but in digital contexts. Okay, it's digital products and services as well. So they can be a service, but it tends to be more discrete. So you might be focusing on an app or a website, and that's your kind of your focus. But it's more digital. That's how it distinguishes itself from other disciplines. I mean, Grace, did you want to?
I think it's great.
Add anything to that for the guys?
I don't know anything about it.
But it's great that I think. Firstly, it's great that you invited also so different people here, because I don't even know what UX is, and you guys like, where does that guy come from? But I mean, if I can translate user experience into architecture, then it's the human experience of the inhabitant of a space, or the person who buys coffee at Starbucks. And Starbucks, interesting example, probably falls in the Uber category. But I just went to a Starbucks on my last trip to Hanoi, and all of a sudden, Starbucks in Hanoi looks like a single origin in Surrey Hills. But the full package with bearded, tattooed baristas and slow drip, I don't know, Ecuadorian, single origin something, and a big slogan, we specialize in finding the rarest quantities of exclusive coffees from around the world. I'm like, what? You guys, I thought you put everybody else out of business and do exactly what you say about Uber, not paying your staff, exploiting the environment and everything else. But so the experience that they're now selling is that they're all of a sudden like the coolest recyclable company in the world. And so that's the user experience in an architecture environment that we're currently experiencing, where everybody is trying to bring this admittedly fake, or very fake, but kind of, it's this thing about fake and authentic, right? Authentic, fake, 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 authentic, authenticity. So Starbucks is trying to be a Surrey Hills coffee shop, while Surrey Hills coffee shop is probably trying to make commercial sense of having 3 bearded, tattooed baristas making handmade coffee and still trying to sell it under $5 or something. So it's a contradiction, and I personally don't have a solution to that. I think what Uber does very successfully is offering an alternative to an industry, which is the taxi industry, which I think is not delivering a good service to people. It's expensive, it's rude, it's unsafe, it's everything that I experience on a day-to-day basis with taxis is the opposite of an experience that you want, being welcomed, having a name, having a destination, being offered a drink on the way, I don't know, the things like being made comfortable. And so from that perspective, Uber did an amazing job. I know there's issues, but so the whole thing about the internet and essentially knocking all of these industries that haven't looked after their customers essentially off the shelf and offering an alternative. And I mean, that I'm sure, who was recently in trouble, the Powerhouse, who was, in charge of exhibiting, collecting, and promoting designers around Sydney and around Australia. they put the design of their new logo on some online platform. It's like, who gives me a new logo? Which was meant to be cool, but in a way it puts all of you out of business, right? If all of a sudden designer in Sydney, $45 or whatever an hour, designer in Russia, $2, designer in Sri Lanka, 20 cents, and they're all designers, you know? And in architecture, of course, as well, we usually get hired now for concepts because we're very good at that. But then all the production, like, we're too expensive. Our rent is too expensive. Our coffee at Single Origin is too expensive. Our rent, everything is too expensive, right? Our minimum wage in Australia is too expensive. So I think there's so many interesting things emerging at the same time. It's a really interesting time. I often feel really blessed. I wake up and think, like, I don't know if people 100 years ago woke up with that same feeling of being in this complete new environment every 5 years.
So, Chris, I'll just stay with you for this next sort of segue, and I'm just talking about more like the city now and the built environment, because we've touched on tech a lot and change, but you spoke about nature. So I suppose, like, you know, how can the city really satisfy its needs for nature and also technology at the same time, in your view?
Well, my dream is always that the city is like a coral reef, for example. It's a living organism with millions of different species that are all thriving together with the same resources, sharing the same resources, competing in a healthy way, reproducing and enjoying themselves, and producing such a colorful, varied environment. And I know it's a very romantic picture, but when you look at New York, for example, which is based on a grid, numbered from 1 to 10 and from A to Z, it's kind of, that's the opposite of a city. And I always think that that we architects and engineers somehow, with the Industrial Revolution, etc., try to simplify matters and just put everything into a grid, essentially. And before that, the Greek islands are not a grid. The Greek islands is someone builds a house, and someone else builds a house on top, and the third one builds a house underneath, and they're all kind of sharing the same three-dimensional space. And I think now, with new technologies in design and a lot of interesting topics that are emerging about urbanism and who owns what, and air rights and transfers and so on, we are entering a stage again where we can achieve a new complexity which was previously engineered out, where, you know, the city becomes a three-dimensional network, and maybe flying cars and autonomous cars are part of that. And then how does the city react to that? And how do you share energy? How do you share resources? How do you share space? And this is like a humble beginning of sharing space. I think it's very exciting times for the city. And of course, it comes back to who owns these land pieces and so on. Is it land lease, or is there another model? You know, and I think it's a big topic for you.
Yeah, Rob, I'm seeing a lot of nods from you.
Yes.
As Chris was talking, let's hear it.
Yes, got all the right away. Yeah, I agree with most of what you say, and I think it's really an exciting time as well. One thing you didn't really mention, but I'm a landscape architect by training, so I always look at the landscape that is under the city. So where we are now is probably one little peninsula underneath somewhere here, which has its own hydrological system and has its own ecology. And if you can use that in the sense that you can build a new type of city out of it, then we will be brought back to the place where we actually are. I think we forget a lot about the place where we are, how inventive we are. Even we can make hundreds of inventions, but still the place where we are, we kind of forget that, because the city is getting over it. We've got cars everywhere, there's roads over it. So bringing that connection back into the system. And I agree completely with the idea of even raising the level of complexity in the city. I also think that engineers have kind of ruined our world a bit. Coming from the Netherlands, we had to fight against water, and our engineers actually helped us to save us. That's our message. What did they do? They built dikes and higher dikes and higher dikes, higher dikes, until they are so high they even fall over. So a disaster is the next thing that happens. So this kind of very well thought through and calculated measures eventually will not help us. Instead, I think we need to start building with nature, or use nature as our metaphor or way of thinking, to build up or rebuild basically the capacity that the city actually expanded out of the whole thing. There's maybe one small example how that works is the sand engine in front of the Dutch coast. They just put a lot of sand in front of the coast, and the sea, through its currents and waves, will actually build up new beaches and new dunes that are stronger than the strongest dike can ever be. So building that kind of systemic capacity into your city would actually create a higher form of complexity and therefore a higher form of adaptability in the whole system. And eventually we might survive then.
Grace, I couldn't see your thinking face, but I'm just keen to hear about like how it plays out at Deloitte and digital. I mean, is this kind of thing, like, are you able to bring this sort of thinking into it? Because obviously this is, you know, a lot of what your mindset is about, you know, this level of thinking, but in terms of influencing things there, like how does that play out? I mean, talking about the city, nature, technology, and that sort of moving to this new discourse, I suppose.
All right, so before we were talking about integrated value proposition. So with scale, that's fine, but we don't exist as an island. We are, you know, we're all a part of, you know, quantum physics, that kind of stuff. And we need to look at things across silos. So within business, you know, you have one business that wants to achieve this, and they're not looking at anyone else because at the end of the day, they have to feed their family. They have the KPIs they need to meet. They want to get a raise, and that's like really, you know, just boring things that people don't want to deal with. But on a day-to-day basis, they don't want to challenge themselves, and that's what you get, you know, you result in 20 different apps being built for the same organisation. So and they don't speak to each other. So what we're trying to do is create integrated value propositions at scale, so at the level of within government and organisations that affects change in multiple, you know, if you think of an octopus that, you know, have lots of tentacles, affect change in the head so that it kind of goes down and there's continuity. Because that's the change that we need to see to realise non-dystopic futures. And if we look at, you know, if we look at Uber, the way that, you know, and, you know, I can speak for Deloitte, but this is more for myself. What I'm trying to achieve within Deloitte, with the power of Deloitte, is being able to be really critical and interrogate a future before we design it. So we can say, yeah, let's have autonomous vehicles, and we're all going to be on drones, and we're all going to do this, and we're all going to do this. And people get really excited, and the walls are so colourful with Post-it notes, and it's all like, whoa! But, you know, what's next from that? Let's be critical about that. Let's interrogate that before we make it a reality, or otherwise we're just going to end up in Black Mirror, right? So with Uber, it's like, cool, you want to make another car share thing, which is, you know, the share economy, that's amazing, but that model isn't great. So what we're able to do with Deloitte, because we have so many different skill sets, I can go, all right, so what do the economists think? What do the actuaries think? What do the human capital people think? And what does that integrated approach look like to be able to solve the problem from a lens that is not just my own, but that is truly integrated and with citizens, so that when you get to the bottom of the tentacles, someone that is booking an Uber, they're thinking, yeah, this is a cool, I'm getting a great experience, but at the top of the octopus head, it's not an evil company. It is a cooperative which is distributing the power, and it's not just, I'm going to hold all of your money and you're going to get nothing and you work for me and you have, you're liable for everything and I'm liable for nothing, but that the drivers have control and that's more equitable. So what we're trying to do is solve those big problems before anything gets done.
Cool. Rob?
Yeah, I'm not talking about Ubers, which I think they're great, but to use. But I want to talk about time because there's a fantastic story from a place in India called Aurora Village, of which people there started to build up that place, but they didn't start building buildings, they started with building the ecology. That took them 50 years before they even started with building buildings in that place. So imagine what that means, that if you want to create nature in which we as humans can live in buildings, probably, gives you a totally different perspective on the development of your city. Now we are used to just build buildings because we want to live in it, and we forget basically that this time factor is there. So thinking in this, dimensions of 50 years of development, and then eventually it is ready to accept people. And by the way, this huge forest there used to be a desert, so they transformed the whole ecology. And I think that's a way of thinking that you could at least virtually apply to existing cities. Imagine that CBD would be an ecology within which we participate, or within which we live and work. I think there would be a change of mind that is quite interesting to actually design.
Oh, we've got another, to wrap it up. We're running late.
I was just going to make a quick comment anyway, which is, it seems to me that what we are possibly talking about, if there is a commonality, is kind of trying to work out systems that work in place at smaller scale, something that we used to call place, locales, bioregions, things that actually function with some local specificity. In the way that you were talking about the tentacles of the of the octopus, yeah, being able to kind of function in those particular ways, without, we now can do that. That's exactly what a platform behind Uber allows you to do. You can have that kind of UX customer experience locally. It doesn't have to be owned by a multinational. It doesn't have to be owned by large-scale capital. Just as you were saying, the question for a more complicated city is, so does Lend-Lease own it all? So we've got to start to actually think, if we're going to have these kind of sustainable futures that take into account this kind of complexity, or take into account that kind of time, that take into account this type of governance, we have to do a lot braver work about that sort of mid-level scale and the way those mid-level scales interact without ceding their autonomy to some governing large-scale capital entity. So I love the Uber UX experience. It's not necessary to be owned by Uber. It can be owned by a union of taxi drivers. It can be owned by a city. It can be owned by a cooperative. That's the really interesting thing about all these UX value propositions. They don't have to all be owned by Facebook or Google. And trying to think about that system, trying to work out how we can actually embrace mid-level, bio-regional, place-specific versions of value propositions, whether they're architectural and the experience of the city, or whether they're integrated value propositions, or whether they're just UX, that is sustainable design.
A nice way to finish. Thanks, Cam. And put a round of applause for the guys. Solid. I'm sure we could go for a lot longer.